One of the questions I get asked a lot is, which translation is the best? Now, in English, we've got a lot of English translations available to us with different translation philosophies. And so we look at all these choices and we ask ourselves, well, which one is the best so I can be using the best? Now, let me start off with an illustration. Let's pretend you look at a fork, a knife, and a spoon. If I were to ask you the question, which one is the best, how would you answer? Now, since this is a video, I'll tell you what most of my students say. It's either the fork or the spork. I think those are good answers. Personally, I do think it's a fork. But on a real practical level, we don't really consider one to be better than the other. What we do is we ask ourselves, well, what am I eating with, and that's what I'm gonna eat, and that's what I'll eat with. For example, if you've got spaghetti, then you're not going to use a spoon. You're going to go for the fork. That's the best tool for what you're doing. You've got soup. You're going to want to use a spoon. In that case, a fork's not going to be very helpful. And if you're in a knife fight, you want a sharp knife. The fork, or the knife, or the spoon, they're not in and of themselves better or inferior to one another. The real question is, what are we going to do with it? What is it that we're trying to do? It's the same thing with Bible translation. There is no one translation that's the best or better than others. The real question is, what do you want to do with that Bible translation? Because you can do different types of studies. You can have different goals when you read. And so you have to ask yourself, what do you want to do? And then the real key is to know how different translations, how different translations work, so that you can use their strengths to your advantage. So that's really the key, is how do different translations work. So let's take a look at Bible translations and the different philosophies behind them. Now, first, you would think that translating a phrase or a passage from one language to another is a fairly simple task, but it's actually not. Anytime you're translating, you have to choose between two things. One is called form and the other is function. And every Bible translation deals with the choice between form and function with a different philosophy or with in a different way. Now, let me explain to you what form and function is, and then we'll talk about how various translations deal with that. Let's take the Spanish phrase, ¿Qué pasa, que le pasa? And suppose we want to translate it into English. Well, we could take one of two routes. The first route we will call the formal translation route. And what you do then is you take each word. Now let's start with the Spanish word for que. And you ask yourself, okay, what does que mean in Spanish? And then once you kind of get an idea of how it's used, you ask yourself, well, what word is there in English that you would use in the same way as the Spanish word for que? Now it happens to be the word what. So the closest English parallel we have to the Spanish word que is what. Then you go to the next word. What is the Spanish word for pasa? What does the Spanish word pasa mean? And what's the closest English equivalent? And then you get the word happens. Then you take the last word there, and it's calabaza. And calabaza is the Spanish word for pumpkin. So you put those three together, and you have a formal translation of the Spanish phrase "¿Qué pasa, calabaza?" In English, the formal translation is "What happens, pumpkin?" Now, this is a word-for-word translation, and notice how, because we went word for word, we're missing out on the meaning of what it means. If you weren't familiar with Spanish, "What happened, pumpkin?" doesn't make any sense in English. Now, the other route you could do is say, you know what, I'm not so concerned about what the individual words, for the English equivalent of each individual words. What I'm really considered is that when I finish a sentence, it has the same idea in English that it does in Spanish. That's functional translation. Probably the closest equivalent as far as the whole phrase goes. In English, it's "What's up?" ¿Qué pasa, calabaza? Is just a cute way of asking somebody what's happening in their lives. And in English, we use "What's up?" Now you can see here that we didn't go word for word. Que is what. I've got apostrophe s here, but that is what is up is probably the full phrase. Pasa does not mean is in English, and up does not mean pumpkin. So as you can see, we have to sacrifice the direct English equivalent of the individual words, so that when we're done with the phrase, we have an English translation where the phrase means the same thing as it does in Spanish. So look at these two extremes here. And one, you're sticking to the original wording and you're translating it word for word, but at a certain point you're giving up the meaning. So you're more concerned with form, or the word for word idea, and not so concerned with meaning. Now on the flip side, you've got a functional translation, which is so concerned with meaning that they're willing to give up individual words. Now, one of these is not better than the other. For example, if I'm translating for a speaker, I used to translate on missions trips, and if somebody were to ask the question "¿Qué pasa calabaza?", I wouldn't tell the person I'm translating for, hey, this person just was asking what happens pumpkin, because that would not be very helpful. On the other hand, if I want somebody to understand what the words mean in the phrase, I would have to go with a formal translation. So you can see that one is not better than the other, but simply that they have different philosophies and they can be used in different situations. Now let's take a look at an example of an English verse. Here's one taken from the New Testament, and I'm starting off with Young's literal translation because it's the most formal translation I'm aware of. In fact, if you're good enough with Greek, if you're good with Greek vocabulary, you can actually probably get really close to the original Greek wording behind this phrase, because it sticks so closely to the original Greek wording that you can really recreate the original Greek behind this English translation. But notice it doesn't make a ton of sense. That your boasting may abound in Christ Jesus in me through my presence again to you. You don't talk like that in English. You don't tell people, you would never use this kind of a phrase in English, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. You might be getting some glimpses of what possibly is happening, but as long as I've taught, I don't think anybody's ever, I think I've had one or two students guess or know what it's talking about, and both of them because they were familiar with this verse. Here's another formal translation. It's not quite as formal, but it's still pretty tough. So that your proud confidence in me may abound in Christ Jesus through my coming to you again. Now notice how they made some things a little easier to understand. For example, through my presence again to you was softened up to make a little more sense when they wrote through my coming to you again. So coming to you again makes a little more sense than through my presence again to you. But still, the verse as a whole is still kind of tough to understand. The King James is a little softer still, but we're well within a formal translation here. But it reads, that your rejoicing may be more abundant in Christ for me by my coming to you again. Now notice that they've switched from boasting and pride to rejoicing. They're trying to make you understand that he's not really talking about being proud or boasting, but now we're talking more about joy. So softening it up even a little more. Now your NIV is somewhere in the middle between form and function. They've tried to soften it up quite a bit, but stick as much to the word order as possible. And so you've got this reading here. So that through my being with you again, your joy in Jesus Christ will overflow on account of me.